The training hangar went completely silent when Captain Derek Voss slammed the woman into the concrete floor and pressed his boot against the back of her neck. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just lay there while 40 soldiers watched, some of them laughing, some of them looking away. Voss thought he had broken her. He thought the moment was over. Then, slowly, so slowly it almost looked deliberate, Nurse Mara Calloway pushed herself off the floor, stood upright, and turned to face him with an expression that wasn't anger, wasn't humiliation, and wasn't fear. It was something closer to patience, like she was waiting for him to realize what he had just done. If you want to know what happens next, stay until the very end of this story. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The alarm went off at 04:45, same as every morning, and Mara Calloway was already awake. She had been lying on her back in the narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling of the on-call quarters attached to Iron Vale Military Medical Center on the western edge of Colorado Springs, listening to the heat system knock and rattle in the walls. Outside, the November wind cut across the base like something with a purpose, the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. She sat up, swung her legs over the side of the bunk, and pressed her feet flat against the floor. Old habit. Grounding herself before the day got its hands on her. The room was small and functional. A bunk, a metal locker, a narrow desk pushed against the wall with a lamp that flickered sometimes, and a mug she kept forgetting to wash. A single framed photograph sat on the desk. A mountain ridge somewhere in northern Nevada, taken at dawn, no people in it, just rock and light. Mara showered, dressed in her duty uniform, and walked down the corridor toward the main medical wing. The base was already moving. Through the corridor windows, she could see vehicles rolling through the pre-dawn dark. A PT formation jogging across the parade ground in formation. A cluster of soldiers huddled outside the motor pool. The machine of it, she thought, always running. Even when nothing urgent was happening, the base had this low hum of motion, like a current under the surface of everything. She had been at Iron Vale for 4 months. 4 months of 12-hour shifts in the trauma bay, of filling medication logs and briefing combat readiness packets, and sitting through joint unit meetings where she was usually the only person without a combat badge on their uniform. 4 months of being referred to, often within earshot, as the nurse. Not her name, not her rank, just the nurse, said the way you might say the clerk or the receptionist. A placeholder word for a person who didn't quite fit the category everyone else was in. She didn't complain about it. Complaining would have required her to care more than she currently had bandwidth for, and her bandwidth was occupied by things that mattered: patient outcomes, medication protocols, a staff training curriculum she was trying to revise before the new quarter started. The social architecture of the base, who respected whom, who resented what, was background noise. She filed it away. She kept moving. The trauma bay was quiet when she arrived, which was either a good sign or the calm before something unpleasant. Sergeant First Class Delora Tish, who ran the night shift with the intensity of someone managing a space launch, gave Mara the handoff report without looking up from her clipboard. 2 admissions overnight. Fractured radius from a vehicle training exercise, treated and released. 1 soft tissue injury from a dismounted patrol drill, currently resting in Bay 3, nothing to worry about. Tish finally looked up. And Dr. Harrow wants the joint unit readiness drill documentation on his desk by 0800. I sent it yesterday, Mara said. He wants a revised version. He didn't give me revision notes. Tish gave her a look that communicated very efficiently that this was not her problem. He said you'd know what to change. Mara didn't argue. She went to the nursing station, pulled up the documentation on the terminal, and spent 20 minutes staring at a report she had already written correctly the first time, searching for whatever invisible error she was apparently supposed to intuit. She made 3 minor formatting adjustments, changed the section headers to align with the updated departmental style guide, and sent it again. She suspected Dr. Harrow would find something else wrong with it. He usually did. It wasn't malice, exactly. Or not only malice. Dr. Marcus Harrow was the kind of man who used small corrections to establish dominance, who treated people who worked under him the way a person treats a tool they're not sure they trust, constantly testing, always skeptical, never quite satisfied. He was thorough and technically skilled, and Mara could admit that, even if he managed to make every interaction feel like a minor inspection she hadn't been warned about. She had met men like him before, in different places, different institutions, different uniforms. The same basic operating logic. Find someone who doesn't fit your idea of what belongs here, apply pressure, and see what breaks. She hadn't broken yet. She didn't expect to start. By 0700, the base had fully woken up, and the training hangar, a wide concrete structure attached to the main operations complex on the east side of Ironvale, was already filling up. Today was the first day of a joint combat readiness evaluation, a 3-day assessment that pulled together medical, combat, and support personnel in integrated simulations. It was designed to test how units functioned under stress, how communication held up under pressure, and whether the medical staff could keep pace with the tactical teams during a live sim environment. Mara had been assigned to attend as the medical unit's representative. She had reviewed the training schedule, prepared her kit, and arrived 5 minutes early. She was the only nurse in the room. The rest of the space was occupied by combat soldiers, mostly from the 4th Infantry Brigade combat team stationed at Ironvale, mixed with a contingent from a special operations element that Mara recognized by their kit and their deliberate, unhurried way of occupying physical space. Experienced people. She could tell at a glance, the way they stood, how they positioned themselves near exits and walls out of habit, the way their eyes moved across a room without their heads following. She took a position near the wall and ran through her kit checklist while the briefing assembled. Captain Derek Voss entered the hangar at 0710, and the energy in the room shifted in the way it does when someone with rank and confidence walks into a space they consider their own territory. I was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been good-looking once and had since developed into something harder and more deliberate. He wore his uniform the way some men wore authority, like a weight they'd gotten used to and now preferred. He had a reputation. Mara had picked up pieces of it in her 4 months at Ironvale, decorated in 2 combat rotations, certified as a Ranger-qualified instructor, aggressive in training and proud of it. Men under his command either performed at the edge of their capability or they were gone. He had no patience for what he called passengers. He also had a specific and consistent opinion about medical personnel in combat training environments. He had expressed that opinion publicly and often, which was how it had filtered down to the nursing wing where Mara worked. He thought they didn't belong there. He was doing a walk of the room when he reached Mara. He stopped, looked at her badge, her rank, her unit designation. "Calloway," he said, not a greeting, more like a notation. "You're from the medical unit." "That's right," she said. "Nurse?" "Correct." He looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite contempt. It was something more calculated than contempt, like he was working out a problem. "We run hard in this exercise. This isn't a clinic. People hit the floor in here." "I read the training schedule," Mara said. "Reading it and surviving it are different things." "I've noticed that's true of most things," she said. Something crossed his face. Brief, quickly managed. Mild irritation at not getting the reaction he expected. He moved on without another word, and Mara watched him go and said nothing. The morning session was a standard assessment block. Physical readiness benchmarks, obstacle navigation, equipment familiarity drills. Mara moved through each station without comment. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was doing the work as it appeared in front of her. Obstacle run. She ran it. Load-bearing exercise. She completed it. Weapons familiarization. Communications equipment check. Field dressing simulation under time pressure. She wasn't the fastest in any single category. She wasn't trying to be. She was consistent, and she was precise, and she didn't stop. Around the 3rd station, she became aware that people were noticing. Not in an obvious way. No one said anything, no one pointed, but she could feel the shift in attention the way you feel a change in air pressure. Soldiers who had been ignoring her started watching. A few exchanged glances she wasn't meant to interpret but could. Captain Voss noticed too. She could see it in the way his eyes tracked back to her between observation sweeps of the room. Whatever he had expected from the nurse, this wasn't it, and that seemed to bother him in a specific and personal way. At 1100, during a break between stations, one of the younger soldiers, a specialist named Garrett Finn, maybe 23 years old, with a gap in his front teeth and the nervous energy of someone trying to figure out where they fit, sidled up next to her at the water station. "You been doing this long?" he asked. "Doing what?" "The training, this kind of stuff. You move like you've done it before." "I've done some training," Mara said. He seemed like he wanted to press further but wasn't sure if that was appropriate. He settled for, "Most of the nurses they bring through these joint exercises don't last past the first hour." "I'm still here," she said. He grinned at that. "Yeah, you are." She refilled her water and went back to her position. The afternoon session changed the atmosphere in the room. Captain Voss had designed the second half of the day as a stress inoculation block, what the training manual called a dynamic pressure exercise, and what the soldiers called, with reasonable accuracy, organized chaos. It involved a multi-room building mock-up constructed inside the hangar, a set of role players acting as both threats and hostages, and a communication system that was deliberately degraded to simulate field conditions. Teams would be assigned specific objectives. They would have to complete them under time pressure, with incomplete information and with active interference from the opposing role-play element. Voss called out team assignments personally. He moved through the list with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times. Then he reached the end of the list and paused, and in that pause Mara felt the air in the room change again. "Calloway." He said it loud enough for the whole hangar to hear. "You're on first entry." First entry meant the lead team, the first through the door, the position that absorbed the most initial contact and had the least margin for error. It was not where you put an unproven person on a good day. On a day where someone was trying to make a point, it was exactly where you put someone you expected to fail publicly. A few soldiers exchanged glances. Someone coughed. Specialist Finn, standing across the room, looked at the floor. Mara looked at Captain Voss and said, "Understood." He seemed momentarily taken aback by the speed of her agreement. He had expected at least a hesitation, maybe a question, maybe a moment of visible anxiety he could use to confirm what he'd already decided about her. She gave him none of those things. She checked her kit, confirmed her radio, moved to the staging point near the entrance of the mock-up structure, and waited for the signal. The team assigned to her, 3 soldiers, none of whom had worked with her before, gathered around the entry point with varying degrees of skepticism on their faces. The most vocal of them was Staff Sergeant Terrence Mull, a stocky, quiet-faced man in his early 30s who had the look of someone who had been in enough bad situations to stop being surprised by them. He was not rude, exactly, but his communication was minimal in the way that communicated, clearly, that he was reserving judgment. "You have a primary on entry?" he asked. "Left breach," Mara said. "You go right. Okafor and Dunn hold the threshold until we establish the first room. Nobody moves until I call it." Mull looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before." "Entry assessment," she said. "Let's run through it quickly before the clock starts." He nodded. Brief, clipped. But he listened. The signal went. What happened in the next 4 minutes was difficult to describe afterward, partly because it moved too fast for anyone on the outside to track cleanly, and partly because the people who experienced it were each too focused on their own small piece of it to assemble a complete picture until it was over. What the observers and the opposing role-play team reported, when asked to reconstruct it. She went through the first door before anyone had time to process the signal. Not recklessly. There was nothing reckless about it. The movement was assessed, immediate, and based on information she had read in the layout before anyone else. She cleared the first room in under 8 seconds. She communicated position with the kind of brevity that meant everyone on her team knew exactly where she was and where they needed to be without needing explanation. She navigated the second room while Staff Sergeant Mull held the corridor, identified both hostage role players by their body language before the opposing team had finished positioning, and had the room secured before the first 60 seconds were finished. She found 2 role players playing hidden threats in the third room. One was behind a partition that wasn't obvious from the entry point. She went to it without hesitation, as though she had already triangulated the position from the sounds and angles she'd processed in the first room. The exercise ended in 3 minutes and 42 seconds. The training record for the simulation block was 4 minutes and 51 seconds, set 8 months prior by a team from the Special Operations contingent that most of the brigade-level soldiers talked about in the tone you use for things you don't expect to see equaled. The hangar was very quiet. Mara walked back out through the entry point, cleared her weapon, and went to her water. Captain Voss had not moved from his position near the observation station. He was looking at the timer display, then at her, then at the timer display again. One of the Special Operations soldiers, A compact, weathered man in his 40s whose name tape read Braddock leaned toward the officer next to him and said something in a low voice. The officer shook his head slowly. Both of them were looking at Mara. Staff Sergeant Mull walked up next to her. He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you do entry training?" he said finally. "I had some field experience," she said. "That's not a certification program." "No," she said. "It's not." He looked at her for another moment. There was something shifting in his expression, the carefully neutral look giving way to something that might, eventually, become respect. He didn't push further. He went back to his team. Across the room, Captain Voss turned and walked toward the back corridor without looking at her again. The afternoon continued. Mara ran 2 more simulation blocks, one as a support element, once in the communications denial scenario, where the teams had to function with only visual signals and hand codes. She performed both assignments completely. Not perfectly. She made a positioning error in the 3rd scenario that cost her team 12 seconds on a secondary objective, and she knew it before anyone pointed it out. But cleanly and with the kind of adaptability that people who had only ever trained in controlled environments rarely demonstrated. By 1700, the hangar was wrapping up. Teams were debriefing in clusters. The energy was different from what it had been in the morning. There was a specific kind of silence around certain people that comes when something has shifted and no one has quite figured out how to talk about it yet. Dr. Harrow appeared at the hangar entrance at 17:15, which was unusual. He almost never attended training-side activities. He was looking for Mara Calloway. He crossed the floor toward her, and his expression had the slightly elevated quality it got when something had happened that required him to reassert a certain order of things. "The Joint Readiness Coordinator flagged your assignment for review." "Which assignment?" she asked. "The first entry position. I need to know who authorized that placement." "Captain Voss assigned the teams." Harrow paused. He had clearly not known that. He adjusted. "Regardless, the medical unit's participation in this evaluation is observational and supporting. I need you on the documentation side of the exercise, not the operational side." "The training schedule listed full participation for all attached personnel," Mara said. "The schedule was drafted before I reviewed the parameters." She looked at him steadily. "Then the schedule should be revised before tomorrow's session." Something flickered in his face. Not anger exactly, closer to the expression of a person who had said something they intended to land a certain way and found it had not quite connected. "We'll discuss it in the morning," he said. He left. Specialist Finn appeared at her elbow. "What was that about?" "Administrative question," Mara said. "He's going to bench you tomorrow, isn't he?" She didn't answer that. Finn looked at her with the open, uncomplicated directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to perform his reactions. "You broke the simulation record today. You know that, right? The one from Bravo team from 8 months ago." "I saw the clock," she said. "Does that not... I don't know. Does that not mean something to you?" She considered the question seriously, which seemed to surprise him. "It tells me I was accurate today," she said. "Tomorrow's a different problem." He looked at her like he was trying to work something out. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "What did you do before this? Before Ironvale, before the medical unit?" She picked up her kit bag and settled it on her shoulder. "I worked in medical," she said, and she walked toward the exit. She was halfway to the door when she heard Captain Voss's voice behind her. Not aimed at her, aimed at someone near him, but loud enough to carry. "Let's not make more of this than it is," he was saying. "She got a favorable run on a single block. The evaluation is 3 days. The clock doesn't lie, but context does." Someone murmured a response she couldn't hear. "She's a nurse," Voss said. "You put anyone with decent athletic conditioning through a training sim and they'll look good once. The question is what happens when it's real." Mara did not stop walking. She did not turn around. She pushed through the hangar door and into the cold Colorado air and let it hit her face, let the sound of the wind fill in where the hangar had been. The sky was going dark fast, the mountains on the western edge of the base catching the last light. She stood there for a moment, just breathing. Not because she was upset. Not because Voss's words had found some soft place in her. She had heard versions of that sentence more times than she could count in more contexts than she cared to list, and it no longer had the effect it was designed to have. She stood there because in 4 months of being watched and doubted and quietly managed toward the edges of things, she had not once allowed herself to stand still long enough to feel the full weight of where she was and what it was costing her. She allowed herself 30 seconds of that. Then she went back to work. The problem waiting for her in the medical wing was not a small one. She found it in the form of a message on her terminal when she returned to the nursing station at 1800. A notification from the Training Division Administrative Coordinator, flagging her personnel file for qualification review, pending Dr. Harrow's request. The flag was routine in appearance, standard language, standard format. But what it meant in practical terms was that her participation in the joint evaluation could be suspended while the review was processed. Reviews of this kind moved slowly. 3 days meant nothing to an administrative flag that could take a week to clear. She sat with this for a moment. Then she opened her personnel file, pulled the qualification documentation she had brought to Ironvale when she transferred, and cross-referenced it against the training division's participation requirements for the joint evaluation. She found the relevant regulation in 12 minutes, cross-referenced it with the updated Joint Medical Personnel Training Directive that had been issued in March of that year, made a note of the specific clause numbers, drafted a short, precise response to the administrative coordinator, citing each clause and documenting the basis for her participation without asking anyone for permission and without inflating the language past what the situation required. She was not going to argue about this. She was going to document it correctly and let the documentation do what documentation was supposed to do. She sent the response at 1837. By 1900, she was in the break room with a cup of coffee she hadn't had time to make until now, reviewing the next day's training schedule on a printed copy she'd picked up from the coordinator's box. The break room was empty except for a corpsman named Yolanda Rice, who was eating a sandwich and reading something on her phone, and who had the particular gift of comfortable silence. Mara went through the schedule. Day 2 had a new block she hadn't seen on the original plan, a close-quarters scenario with a medical component built in, specifically requiring the medical representative to function in a dual role, tactical support and trauma treatment simultaneously. It was harder than anything on day 1. It was also, she noticed, exactly the kind of scenario that would be designed to expose someone who was adequate in one role but not genuinely qualified across both. She thought about that. Someone had added that block. It wasn't on the original schedule she'd reviewed. It had appeared in the updated version posted this evening. She did not know, with certainty, whether it had been added by Captain Voss, by Dr. Harrow, or by someone else with a stake in the outcome of the evaluation. She didn't have enough information to determine that yet. What she knew was this. The scenario was survivable. It was hard, and it was designed to be hard, and whoever had added it had done so believing she couldn't handle it. She was going to handle it. She finished her coffee, said goodnight to Rice, and went back to her quarters. It was not yet 2000, and she was running on 4 hours of sleep from the night before, and the particular low-grade weight that comes from a day of being underestimated by people with enough authority to make it inconvenient. She sat at her desk for a moment, looked at the photograph of the mountain ridge, thought about a ridgeline in a different country, in a different year, in a different kind of dark than Colorado winter, where there had been no training schedule and no administrative coordinator and no personnel flag, only the work and the people, depending on the work being done right. She opened the training manual for the close quarters scenario and began to read. She was on her second pass through the tactical section when the knock came at her door. It was Specialist Finn. He was out of uniform. Civilian clothes, civilian expression, which made him look younger and more uncertain than he did in the hangar. He had something in his hand, a small folded piece of paper. "I'm not supposed to be in this wing," he said immediately. "You're not." "I know, He held out the paper. "I found this in the briefing coordinator's outbox when I was picking up the updated schedule. It wasn't sealed. I shouldn't have read it. But I did." She took the paper, unfolded it. It was a routing slip for an administrative directive, the kind of internal document that moved between commanders as a precursor to formal orders. The language was dry and procedural, but the meaning was clear. It was a recommendation to remove Mara Calloway from the joint evaluation entirely, citing medical personnel protocol compliance concerns and requesting her immediate reassignment to documentation support duties for the remainder of the 3-day assessment. The signature line read, "Marcus Harrow, MD, Senior Medical Officer, Ironvale Military Medical Center." Below Harrow's signature was a second line, a routing notation indicating the document had been reviewed and co-signed before distribution. The second name was Captain Derek Voss. Finn was watching her read it. "I thought you should know," he said quietly. Before tomorrow. Mara folded the paper slowly. She looked at Finn. He had the expression of someone who had taken a risk he wasn't sure how to calculate, who had made a judgment call about what was right and was now waiting to find out if he'd made it correctly. "Thank you," she said. "What are you going to do?" She thought about the mountain ridge in the photograph, about a ridgeline in another country where there had been no administrative process and no personnel file and no documentation chain, just decisions made in the dark with incomplete information and people counting on those decisions to hold. "Tomorrow's session starts at Uru 700, she said. Finn waited for more. She didn't give him more. He nodded once, the way someone nods when they understand they're not going to get the full answer but are willing to trust the partial one. He slipped back into the corridor and the door clicked shut. Mara sat for a moment with the folded paper in her hand. Then she opened her desk drawer, placed it inside, and closed the drawer. She turned back to the training manual. She had a lot of reading to do, and the morning was not as far away as it needed to be. She had a lot of reading to do, and the morning was not as far away as it needed to be. She read until 01:30, went to sleep with the manual still open beside her, and woke at 04:30 when the base's ambient noise shifted in the particular way that meant the overnight quiet was ending and the early rotations were beginning to move. She lay still for 3 minutes, running the tactical layout of the close quarters scenario in her head. Entry points, choke positions, the medical intervention windows that the scenario design had built in, and the gaps where someone unprepared would lose time and composure simultaneously. She had identified 4 gaps. She had solutions for 3 of them. The 4th would depend on variables she couldn't control in advance, which meant she'd have to read it in real time and make the call when it arrived. She got up. She washed her face and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Not vanity, just inventory. She was 34 years old and the Colorado cold had been doing things to the skin around her eyes that she'd only recently begun to notice. There was a scar along her left jawline, thin and almost invisible in most light, that she'd carried so long it no longer registered as something she had once not had. She looked like a person who had been through a series of things, which she had. She got dressed and went to work. The hangar at 0650 had a different texture than it had the morning before. The previous day had been a known quantity, an assessment exercise that everyone understood the shape of before it started. Today carried the specific tension of something that had shifted overnight without anyone formally acknowledging the shift. Word moved fast on bases. People had talked. What happened in the simulation block yesterday had been processed and discussed and interpreted in a dozen different ways, across a dozen different social clusters, and the result was a room that was watching without appearing to be watching. Mara arrived, checked in with the training coordinator, and found her name on the assignment board without the administrative flag she'd been half expecting. Her response to the coordinator must have cleared something, or at least complicated the removal enough to delay it. She filed that information away without expressing it and went to collect her gear. Captain Voss was on the opposite side of the hangar, running a briefing with his senior instructors. He saw her arrive. His expression did not change, which was its own form of information. The morning block was a communications and coordination assessment. Straightforward enough, stressful primarily by design rather than by content. Mara ran it as part of a mixed team, handled her assignments, and didn't make herself conspicuous. She was waiting for the close quarters scenario. That was the one that mattered today. That was the block someone had added to the schedule because they believed it would be the one she couldn't handle. She took a few minutes during the mid-morning break to eat something she didn't really want and drink water she needed and review the layout one more time in her head. Specialist Finn sat near her without comment, eating an energy bar with the focused joylessness of a person fueling a machine. "You sleep?" he asked eventually. "A little. You seem—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Never mind. Say it." "You seem like you already know what's coming," he said. "I have a general idea." He looked at the floor. "They're not going to let you just—" He stopped again. He was trying to find language for something he understood instinctively but couldn't articulate precisely, and she could see the frustration of that on his face. "Finn," she said. He looked up. "Do your job today. Don't think about mine." He nodded. It wasn't dismissal, and he seemed to understand that. She wasn't cutting him off. She was giving him something to stand on when things got complicated later. He finished his energy bar and said nothing else. The close quarters scenario began at 10:30. It was more complex than the previous day's simulation in every respect. The mock-up structure had been expanded overnight. 2 additional rooms added to the floor plan, a second stairwell, a basement access point. The opposing roleplay team had been briefed on more sophisticated tactics. They would adapt to the entry team's movements rather than holding fixed positions, which meant the team couldn't rely on the layout alone. And the medical component was layered directly into the tactical sequence. 2 role players designated as casualties would require active treatment decisions at specific points during the operation, decisions that had to be made under fire, communicated to the team, and executed without stopping the forward movement of the mission. It was genuinely hard, not artificially hard, not staged to humiliate, but the kind of compound problem that required someone who had actually held both functions at the same time in an environment where the margin for error was real. Captain Voss read out the assignments. Mara was on the lead medical tactical position, which was the role the scenario had been built around, the position that required the dual function. 3 combat soldiers, a communications specialist, and 2 additional medical trainees who would function as her secondary support. She accepted the assignment, ran a quick equipment check, confirmed radios, pulled her team for a 4-minute brief she kept precise and unadorned, positions, signals, casualty decision protocols, communication sequence. The 2 medical trainees looked slightly terrified. She gave them specific, concrete tasks that would keep them functional rather than overwhelmed. "You're not responsible for everything," she told them. "You're responsible for your piece. Stay in your piece." The older of the 2, a young woman named PFC Sandoval with dark eyes and the coiled posture of someone waiting for something bad to happen, gave a small, sharp nod. The other, a male trainee named Doyle, who'd been sweating since morning, looked slightly less green. The signal went at 10:45. What unfolded over the next 7 minutes was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that looks impressive from the outside because it was too fast and too fragmented to read as a coherent sequence. The first entry room had been repositioned. The role-play team had moved their initial placement in the 30 seconds before the signal, which was within the scenario rules but not something that had been confirmed in the pre-brief. Mara caught it in the first half-second of the room clear because the sound signature was wrong. A person holds their breath differently than an empty room, and adjusted the team's movement without losing momentum. The first casualty scenario hit 90 seconds in. Role player down in the stairwell, designated gunshot wound to the lower leg, arterial pressure. She had 11 seconds to make the treatment call, communicate it to Sandoval, and maintain the tactical push to the second floor simultaneously. She made the call, communicated it in 4 words, kept moving. The second casualty was harder. 3rd room, 2nd floor, role player with a designated chest wound requiring a decompression decision, which in the training scenario meant identifying the correct intervention from a set of props and communicating the correct protocol under time pressure, while 2 role-play opposing members were actively repositioning around the room's perimeter. She made the wrong call on the first assessment. She caught it within 3 seconds, corrected it, communicated the correction to Doyle, who was running the medical prop sequence, and held the tactical position while the correction was executed. That 3-second error cost them time. It also meant the scenario ended not at a record pace, but at a pace that was, she would calculate it later, approximately 40 seconds slower than optimal. The hangar was quiet again when they came out. Not the same quiet as the day before. Yesterday's quiet had been the shock of something unexpected. Today's quiet was more complicated. It had the texture of people recalibrating. Staff Sergeant Mull was the first one to speak. He walked up to her with the directness of someone who had made a decision about something and wanted to put it on the table before anyone else got there. "You caught the reposition in the first room," he said, "before any of us did." "I heard it," she said. "We didn't." She didn't answer that. "You self-corrected in room 3, he said, "under contact, in 3 seconds." "It took too long," she said. "It took 3 seconds, he said flatly, like he was correcting an arithmetic error. "I've seen surgeons take 30 seconds in a clear environment to make that call." She was aware, peripherally, that several other people were close enough to be hearing this exchange. She didn't change what she was saying or how she was saying it for the audience. "The correction was valid," she said. "The initial read was wrong." "Yeah," Mull said. "It was." He looked at her for a moment. "You're still the best person who's run that block." even with the error. He walked away. Not because he was done with her, she got the impression he might not be done with her for a while, but because he had said what he came to say and he didn't feel the need to decorate it. PFC Sandoval appeared at her elbow, still running high on adrenaline, her voice a little too bright. That was, I don't know what I was expecting, but that was, you held your peace, Mara said. Good work. Sandoval looked like she wanted to say more. Mara gave her a nod and moved away before the conversation could become something larger than it needed to be right now. Emotion was information, and Sandoval's emotion was useful data about how the younger personnel were processing what they'd seen, but this wasn't the time to let it run. She went to her water and her own space and stood there, letting the adrenaline metabolize properly instead of pushing it down where it would sit wrong. Captain Voss was across the room with his senior instructors again. He was talking, low and controlled, and his face had the particular quality of a person who is managing their expression with effort. One of the instructors said something. Voss responded. The instructor nodded. She didn't know what they were saying. She didn't need to. What she knew was this. The scenario that had been designed to be her failure had instead become something else. Not a triumph. She was careful about that word. It invited the wrong kind of thinking. But a data point. A clear, documented time data point in a formal evaluation environment, witnessed by enough people across enough unit types that it couldn't be quietly corrected or reclassified later. Dr. Harrow arrived at 12:30. She saw him come through the side entrance with the administrative coordinator walking half a step behind him, which meant whatever he was here for had documentation attached. He was wearing his medical officer's uniform with the particular rigid posture he adopted when he was operating in official capacity rather than just institutional authority. He found her near the equipment staging area. Calloway. He handed her a document. Paper, printed, formal header. Effective immediately, your participation in the operational components of this evaluation is suspended pending formal review of your qualification documentation. She took the document, read it in 8 seconds. It was the routing slip made formal. The same directive Finn had brought her last night, now processed into an official order with a case number and a review timeline. The review timeline here is 10 days, she said. Standard processing. The evaluation ends in 36 hours. Which is why the review was expedited, he said, which was not what the document said, and he seemed to know it wasn't what the document said. He held her gaze. You'll be assigned to documentation support for the remainder of the assessment. She held the document for a moment. Then she said, I'd like a copy of the regulation that permits a senior medical officer to suspend evaluation participation without direct commanding officer authorization. Something shifted in Harrow's expression. He'd expected anger or defeat. She was giving him a procedural question, stated without heat, in front of 2 witnesses. The administrative coordinator and a corpsman who'd walked up and then stopped, clearly unsure whether to leave. That's an administrative matter, Harrow said. I know, she said, which is why I'd like the regulation citation. The coordinator had taken out a small notepad, apparently out of reflex, and was holding it with the expression of someone who deeply wished they were somewhere else. Harrow said, I'll have it sent to your station. Thank you, she said. He left. The coordinator followed him, not quite fast enough to avoid making it obvious. The corpsman who had stopped nearby, a young man she recognized from the overnight shift named Percival, who had the slightly dazed look of someone witnessing something they hadn't expected to see today, said, very quietly, Did you need something, Percival? No, ma'am, he said, and immediately found somewhere else to be. She folded the directive and put it in her lower left pocket, same pocket as Finn's routing slip from the night before. She was building a document trail she hadn't asked to build and hadn't wanted, but the materials kept arriving and she had learned in a variety of contexts that document trails were most useful when they were complete. The afternoon session, technically, she should not have been part of. She reported to the documentation station as directed, sat down at the desk they'd assigned her, and opened the evaluation assessment forms. They were detailed and specific, and she was thorough in a way that meant by 14:30 she had completed what would typically take most personnel 2.5 hours. She also, in the course of working through the documentation, noticed 2 significant inconsistencies in the evaluation scoring records. places where performance data appeared to have been adjusted between the original entry and the compiled summary. Not dramatically altered, subtly, the kind of shift that moved someone's score from a category that triggered review to a category that didn't. She flagged both, added a notation, saved the file. She was not certain the inconsistencies were intentional. She was not building a case. She was doing the documentation job she had been assigned to do, and the documentation job required her to flag anomalies in the record, which was what she was doing. She saved the file, printed a copy, and put it with the documents in her left pocket. At 15:15, she heard the noise from the hangar floor. It started as a shift in the ambient sound. Voices at a register that meant something had gone wrong, not in a simulated way, but in an actual way. And then there was a sharp, distinct sound that she recognized before she'd consciously processed it. Someone had gone down hard. She was moving before she finished that thought. The scene on the hangar floor was controlled chaos, the particular texture of an emergency that had just happened, and that the people around it hadn't yet organized around. A soldier was on the floor near the second entry point of the mock-up structure, a staff sergeant from the combat team whose name she didn't know, and he was conscious but wrong. His color was bad, his breathing was labored, and one of the other soldiers crouched next to him had 2 fingers on his pulse, and the expression of someone doing that because it was the right thing to do, and not because they knew what to do with the information. Mara hit her knees beside him before anyone had time to ask whether she should be there. The next 90 seconds were simple in the way that real emergencies are simple. There is the problem, and there is what the problem requires, and there is nothing else. The soldier, his name tape read Duval, had gone into an acute stress response compounded by what felt, on rapid assessment, like a pre-existing cardiac irregularity. His pulse was irregular, his blood pressure running high from the exertion and the heat in the hangar. Not a heart attack, not yet, but a body that was telling her very clearly that it was close to a threshold it shouldn't cross. She called for the medical kit in a voice that was not loud, but had the specific quality that makes people move without needing to be told twice. Got the kit. Established the IV line she needed, which on Duval was harder than it should have been because he had the kind of compact, dense arm musculature that rolls veins, and she had to take 2 seconds to choose the right site instead of the obvious one. Got it on the first attempt. Administered the correct intervention, communicated vitals to Corpsman Rice, who had appeared at her side, and kept Duval stable until the full medical response team arrived 4 minutes later. 4 minutes was not a long time. It also wasn't a short time when the person waiting was the person on the floor. Duval was conscious the whole time. At some point in the middle of it, he said, "Am I good?" in the voice of a man who already knew the answer was probably yes, but needed to hear it from someone who wasn't guessing. "You're going to be fine," she told him. "Don't talk." That bad? No, just don't talk. The response team took over. She stepped back, gave the handoff report, clean, specific, no extra language, and moved out of the way. She became aware, slowly, that the hangar had gone completely quiet. Not the evaluation quiet of the last 2 days, something different. The quiet of a room where everyone has just seen something that has reorganized their understanding of a situation. She stripped off her gloves and looked for somewhere to dispose of them. A corpsman appeared with a waste bag. She nodded her thanks. When she turned around, Captain Voss was 3 feet away from her. He had the expression of someone who had been operating on one set of assumptions for a significant period of time and had just discovered, publicly and in front of an audience, that those assumptions were wrong. It wasn't quite the expression she might have expected from him. Not embarrassment, not anger, nothing as simple as either of those. It was something more like the look a person gets when the floor they've been standing on has been quietly moved. He said nothing for a moment. She said nothing. "Duval?" he said finally. "Will he? He needs evaluation at the medical center. He'll be fine if he gets it today." Voss nodded. His jaw was tight. From across the room, near the observation station, the man she had noticed yesterday, the weathered special operations soldier with the name tape that read Braddock, was looking at her with an expression that was not readable at a distance. He had a phone to his ear. He had been on the phone, she realized, for some of the time she'd been working on Duval. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to the phone. Something about that. The call, the timing, the deliberate way he had watched everything that happened today, settled in her chest with the specific weight of a thing she would need to understand soon. Harrow arrived at the hangar 9 minutes later, moving fast and with the look of someone who has been told something and come in prepared to contain it. He looked at Mara, then at Duval being moved onto the transport stretcher, then back at Mara. His face did several things in sequence that he did not intend to be visible. "You administered the IV?" he said. "Yes." "You're on documentation assignment." "He needed an IV," she said. The logic of that sat in the air between them. Harrow was a physician who had, in the course of his career, spent enough time around emergencies to know the difference between a procedural violation and a room-reading call. He was also the man who had signed the directive removing her from operational participation this morning. He said, "We'll discuss the protocol deviation in the morning." "Fine," she said. He turned to oversee Duval's transport. She watched him go. Specialist Finn was at her shoulder again. She was beginning to understand that this was just where he operated now, peripheral and watchful, running some internal calculation about what was happening and where his obligations sat. "Braddock was on the phone for most of that," Finn said quietly. "I noticed." "He called someone," Finn said. "I couldn't hear the whole thing, but I caught—" He hesitated. "What?" "I caught the words JAG officer," Finn said. "And a name. He said a name I didn't recognize." Mara looked across the room at the now empty spot where Braddock had been standing. Finn said, "What does that mean?" She didn't answer right away. She was running something in her head. Not a memory exactly, but a shape. The shape of what Braddock's presence here might mean, and who he might have called, and why the timing of that call aligned with everything that had happened in the last 48 hours as precisely as it appeared to. "It means," she said slowly, "that someone outside this base has been watching what's happening here." She looked at the hangar entrance where Harrow had gone, then at the documentation desk where her printed copy sat in a folder with the routing slip and the administrative directive. "And I don't think they like what they're seeing." The overhead lights in the hangar hummed in the silence. Outside, a vehicle engine turned over in the dark. Somewhere in the administrative complex on the north side of the base, a phone was ringing, and the person it was meant to reach had not yet answered it, and the morning was still several hours away. And whatever was coming with it was already in motion. And whatever was coming with it was already in motion. She slept 3 hours. Not because 3 hours was enough, but because 3 hours was what the night offered before the administrative complex lit up at 05:30, and the sound of vehicles moving on the north road told her that whoever Braddock had called had sent someone with enough rank to move fast and enough purpose to arrive before the base had fully woken up. She heard the vehicles from her bunk, lay still, counted them by sound, 2, maybe 3, not standard transport. The engine weight was wrong for standard transport, heavier, deliberate. She got up. By the time she had dressed and walked to the corridor window that faced the administrative complex, she could see the vehicles parked in the restricted slot outside the JAG and Inspector General Annex, a building that was normally quiet at this hour, normally quiet at most hours, and that now had 3 lights on in offices that should have been dark. A figure in a uniform she couldn't identify from this distance was moving between the 2 rightmost offices, carrying something. She watched for 2 minutes. Then she went to the nursing station, made coffee, and started her shift. The morning moved with the particular compressed energy of a situation that has not yet declared itself but is clearly gathering. Corpsman Rice, on handoff, looked like she hadn't slept. She gave the report quickly and with the careful neutrality of someone who had heard things she was choosing not to comment on. "Duval's stable," Rice said. "Admitted overnight for observation. EKG confirmed the irregularity. Cardiologist is being brought in from the civilian network." "Good call on the admission," Mara said. "It was your call." "I mean keeping him." Rice nodded. She hesitated at the door. "There are people in the JAG annex," she said, "since before 0600. "I know." Rice looked at her with an expression that was trying to be professionally neutral and not quite succeeding. "Is this going to be a problem for you?" "I don't know yet," Mara said honestly. Rice left. Mara drank her coffee and read through the night's patient notes and waited. The summons came at 07:59, delivered by a junior administrative specialist who handed her a printed memo with the careful posture of someone who had been told to deliver it and not to editorialize. The memo directed her to report to Conference Room B in the administrative complex at 0800 for what it described as a qualification and conduct review meeting. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her left pocket with the others. At 0745, she went to her quarters, retrieved the folder from her desk drawer, and reviewed its contents one more time. Finn's routing slip, the formal suspension directive, the printed evaluation scoring records with her anomaly notations, and a one-page summary she had written out longhand the night before. Dates, times, observations, precisely worded, no inference stated as fact. She tucked the folder under her arm and walked to the administrative complex. Conference Room B was a medium-sized space with a rectangular table, 8 chairs, and the particular institutional blandness of a room designed to communicate nothing about the power dynamics of whoever was using it. 3 people were already seated when she arrived. Dr. Harrow, positioned at the left side of the table with a folder of his own. Captain Voss, across from Harrow, his posture carefully controlled in the way that meant he had been briefed on something this morning and was still processing it, and a woman at the head of the table whom Mara did not recognize. She was approximately 50, with short gray-brown hair and the kind of composed stillness that doesn't come from training alone. It comes from years of sitting in rooms where people were trying to manage her and learning to let them try. Her uniform carried the rank insignia of a colonel, and the shoulder patch was JAG Corps. Her name tape read Devereaux. Beside her sat a man in civilian clothes, mid-40s, compact, with a notepad open in front of him that already had writing on it. He looked up when Mara entered. His eyes were the professional kind, the kind that give nothing away. The weathered soldier, Braddock, was not in the room, but his absence felt like a presence. "Nurse Calloway," Colonel Devereaux said. "Please sit." Mara sat across from Harrow, which put her with a clear sightline to both Voss and Devereaux. She placed her folder on the table in front of her, which she could see registered with everyone in the room, though no one commented on it yet. "This meeting is a preliminary inquiry," Devereaux said, "not a formal hearing. We're here to establish a factual record of events over the past 48 hours as they relate to the joint evaluation currently running at Ironvale. I want to be clear about the scope. We are not here to determine disciplinary outcomes today. We are here to establish facts. Do you understand the distinction?" "Yes," Mara said. "Good." Devereaux looked at Harrow. "Dr. Harrow, you initiated the qualification review that resulted in Nurse Calloway's suspension from operational participation. Walk me through the basis for that action." What followed was 20 minutes of Dr. Harrow explaining, in the careful, organized language of a man who had prepared for this, his position on Mara's participation in the evaluation. He cited protocol sections, qualification tiers, the medical personnel directive that governed joint exercise participation. He was thorough. He was not inaccurate in a way that was easy to immediately identify. He was presenting a version of events that was technically grounded and structurally sound. And if you didn't know what he had left out, it was almost convincing. Mara listened. She didn't interrupt. She watched his hands, which were still, and his eyes, which moved to Voss twice during the explanation in a way that was brief and probably not intentional. When Harrow finished, Devereaux looked at Mara. "Response?" Mara opened her folder. She laid the routing slip on the table and slid it toward Devereaux. "This document was prepared before the formal suspension directive was issued. It is a co-signed routing slip recommending my removal, authored by Dr. Harrow and countersigned by Captain Voss." She placed the formal directive beside it. "This is the directive that followed. The routing slip preceded the formal process by approximately 14 hours, suggesting the decision was made prior to any formal review of my qualifications." Harrow said, "That routing slip is a standard." "It's a standard preliminary document," Mara said, not raising her voice, "which means it represents a decision already made. The review was the formality, not the cause." Voss had not spoken since she entered. His jaw was doing something controlled and continuous, the thing that jaws do when someone is thinking faster than they're prepared to show. The civilian beside Devereaux wrote something on his notepad. Devereaux said, "Captain Voss?" Not a question, just his name, in the tone that means, "Your turn." Voss said, "I co-signed the routing slip because Dr. Harrow raised a protocol concern I believed warranted review. My signature doesn't indicate a predetermined outcome." "It indicates agreement with the recommendation," Devereaux said. "With the process of review," he said. The recommendation reads immediate suspension pending review. That's a position, not a process. Devereaux said it without heat, the way you state something that is simply true. She looked at the documents, then at Mara. You also documented scoring anomalies in the evaluation records. Mara slid the printed sheets across. 2 instances where performance data in the compiled summary does not match the original entry records. I flagged them in the system. These are the printed copies. Harrow looked at the sheets. His expression changed in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not the professional management of inconvenience, but something beneath that. Something that looked like the first stage of a problem that had gotten larger than he'd anticipated. Voss looked at the sheets from across the table. His hands, which had been flat on the table surface, moved. I can't speak to data anomalies in the documentation system, Harrow said. That would be an administrative. The anomalies appear to affect evaluation scores for personnel from this medical unit, Mara said. Both instances result in scores being moved from a category that requires supervisory review to a category that doesn't. I am not characterizing the anomalies. I am reporting their existence and their effect. The civilian wrote another line on his notepad. Devereaux was quiet for a moment. She looked at the documents laid out in front of her with the systematic attention of someone who had spent a career reading exactly this kind of paper trail and knew what it meant when the pages told a story the people in the room weren't quite telling. Then she said, "We'll take a 15-minute recess." She looked at Mara. "You'll remain available." "Of course," Mara said. The room emptied except for Devereaux and the civilian, who were already in a low, fast conversation before the door had fully closed. Mara walked to the corridor, stood near the window at the end, and breathed slowly. Outside, the base was running its morning operations as though none of this were happening, which was both ordinary and slightly surreal. 2 soldiers jogged past on the path below. A maintenance vehicle moved along the perimeter road. The mountains sat on the horizon with the complete indifference of things that had been there before any of this and would be there after. She became aware of someone standing near her and looked. It was Voss. He was not going to apologize. She could read that immediately and clearly, and she didn't need him to. Apologies from people like Voss arrived late and cost more than they were worth. But he was standing here, which was something, and the expression on his face was not what it had been for the past 2 days. "You kept the routing slip," he said. "Specialist Finn brought it to me." A muscle in his jaw moved. Finn shouldn't have had access to that document. He found it in the coordinator's outbox. He said it wasn't sealed. Voss looked at the window. "If I had known..." He stopped. Started again. "The scoring records. I didn't adjust the scoring records." "I know," she said. Which she did, actually. The anomalies had the fingerprint of someone who understood the documentation system structure well enough to make changes that looked like formatting errors, and Voss was not that kind of operator. He was a direct force person, not a paper trail person. He looked at her with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't shame, exactly. It was closer to the look of a man standing in a room he built himself and realizing, for the first time, that it was too small. "In the hangar," he said. "When you ran that first simulation..." "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Not now," she said. "Later is fine. Right now I need to focus." He nodded. It was a different kind of nod than any she'd seen from him. He walked back down the corridor. She stayed at the window until the 15 minutes were done. When she re-entered conference room B, Devereaux had brought in 2 additional people she hadn't seen before. A woman in army uniform with a tablet, and a man whose lanyard identified him as being from the Inspector General's office. The civilian with the notepad was still present. The energy of the room had reorganized in the recess, and Mara could feel it the moment she sat down. The preliminary inquiry had shifted into something with more procedural weight. "Nurse Calloway," Devereaux said, "I'm going to ask you some questions about your prior service. I want to be clear that this information is being collected as part of this inquiry and may be relevant to subsequent proceedings." "I understand." "Your personnel file here at Ironvale lists your primary qualification as registered nurse, military occupational specialty 68C, with transfer from Fort Weston, Virginia, approximately 4 months ago." Devereaux looked at a document in her own folder, not at Mara. "The file is notably thin for someone with your years of service." "I'm aware of that," Mara said. Thin in a specific way, Devereaux said. Not absent. Thin in the way that files are thin when there are classification layers that don't migrate with standard transfers. Harrow was very still. Devereaux looked up at Mara. I've requested the full record. Mara said nothing. It will take some hours to clear, Devereaux said, but I want to ask you directly whether there is anything in your prior service record that is relevant to the events of the past 48 hours. The room was very quiet. Mara thought about how to answer this accurately. Not evasively, not dramatically, just accurately. Because the answer to the question Devereaux was asking was yes, and the shape of that yes was complicated, and the room was not yet ready for the full weight of it. My prior service includes assignments that aren't fully reflected in the file that transferred to Ironvale, she said. The gap isn't an error, it was deliberate. Harrow made a sound, not quite a word. The beginning of an objection that didn't find its sentence. Deliberate by whose decision? Devereaux asked. By the command structure of the units I served with, Mara said. The classification was their decision, not mine. I've never requested it. Devereaux absorbed this without changing her expression, which was its own form of confirmation that she had already suspected something along these lines. The performances documented during this evaluation, she said carefully, are they consistent with the qualifications in your classified record? Yes, Mara said simply. Harrow said, Colonel, this changes the nature of the review significantly. If there's a classification issue, we are inside the scope of a preliminary inquiry into personnel conduct and administrative irregularities, Devereaux said, in a tone that was final without being unkind. The classification question is supplementary, not limiting. She looked at Harrow. What it does affect is the basis on which you assessed Nurse Calloway's qualifications as insufficient. If the full qualification record has not been accessible to you, that significantly complicates the validity of that assessment. Harrow opened his mouth, closed it. The IG representative made a note. Devereaux said, We'll reconvene when the full file clears. She looked at Mara. You're released from documentation assignment pending further review. Return to your regular medical duties. It was not vindication. It was a procedural step. But it meant something, and everyone in the room knew what it meant. Mara stood, collected her folder, and walked out. She was in the corridor when she heard the door open again behind her. Footsteps. Not Voss, not Harrow. Lighter, more deliberate. She turned. Braddock was standing in the corridor. Out of the training environment and in full uniform, he carried himself differently than he had in the hangar. The deliberate understatement was still there, but there was a precision to him now that the hangar environment had almost concealed. His name tape read Braddock, but there was no unit designation patch on his uniform, which told her something. He looked at her for a moment. Just looked. The way people look when they're confirming something they already knew. You were at Sector 7, he said. Not a question. She went still. Sector 7 was not a publicly known designation. It was not in any database that a standard transfer file would reference. It was the kind of name that existed in a very small circle of people who had been where Sector 7 was, in the years when it was operational, doing the specific kind of work that it did. I don't know what you're referring to, she said. He nodded slowly, not because he believed her, but because he understood why she said it. The Colonel is going to see your full file in about 3 hours, he said. When she does, the conversation in that room is going to change. Why are you telling me this? He looked at her for a long moment. Because I was at Sector 7 too, he said. 2 years before you, different rotation. And because what's happening to you in that room is something I've seen happen to people who came out of there before. He paused. It doesn't usually end well for them. I'm trying to change that average. He walked past her down the corridor without looking back. She stood in the empty hallway and let that land. 3 hours. She thought about what 3 hours meant, about what the file would show when Devereaux read it, the operational history that wasn't in the Ironvale transfer, the qualification levels that Harrow had dismissed because he'd never seen them documented, the specific engagements and assessments and classified decorations that had been stripped from the traveling record because the units she'd served with operated under a mandate of institutional invisibility. She had carried those years in her body and in her muscle memory and in the specific way she moved through a room and read a threat and made a decision under pressure. And for 4 months at Ironvale, the only people who had seen any of it were the ones who'd been in the hangar. And even they didn't know the source. They were about to know. She walked back to the medical wing, checked in at the nursing station, pulled her patient files, worked through the morning the way she always worked through the morning, methodically, thoroughly, without making it about herself. At 11:30, Corman Rice appeared at the nursing station with the expression she'd been wearing for most of the past 2 days, which was the expression of someone watching a situation they don't fully understand and making peace with not understanding it. "Duvall wants to thank you," Rice said. "He's awake?" Alert and annoyed about the monitoring leads, his words were the nurse who didn't panic. Mara considered going, decided against it for now. "Tell him the monitoring leads are there for a reason." Rice almost smiled. She went back to her duties. The call came at 13:47. Mara's pager, the old-style unit they still used for intra-base communication in the medical wing, went off with a code she recognized as conference room administration. She finished the medication log she was working on, handed it to Sandoval, who was on her first day of an administrative rotation and still moving with the careful precision of someone who didn't want to make errors, and walked back to the administrative complex. The conference room had more people in it. Devereaux was there, the IG representative, the civilian with the notepad. But there were also 2 new figures, a male officer whose rank she recognized as lieutenant colonel from what she could read of the insignia, and standing in the far corner of the room with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has just had several things confirmed that he spent a long time hoping he was wrong about, Captain Voss. And in Devereaux's hand was a manila folder, thick, the kind of folder that had been generated by a records office rather than a local administrator, that had classification markers along its top edge that had been initialed by 2 people she recognized from a distance as senior-level authorizations. Her file. The full one. Devereaux looked at Mara when she entered, just looked for a moment with the expression of someone who is deciding how to begin something that doesn't have an obvious beginning. "Nurse Calloway," she said, "please close the door." Mara closed the door. "I've reviewed your complete service record." Devereaux set the folder on the table, as have Lieutenant Colonel Merritt and the IG representative. She looked at Harrow, who was seated and had the quality of a person who has not moved significantly in some time. "I want to make sure everyone in this room understands what we're working with before we proceed." She opened the folder. Mara Calloway, registered nurse, currently classified at that grade at Iron Vale Military Medical Center. Devereaux's voice was level, professional, giving nothing away in its tone and giving everything away in its precision. Prior to this assignment, Special Operations Combat Medic qualified, Joint Special Operations Command Attachment, 3 overseas deployments under classified mandate. Tactical Combat Casualty Care Instructor Certification, Advanced Trauma Surgical Assist Qualification, Special Reconnaissance Medical Integration. 2 classified commendations, one of which was awarded for... She stopped, looked at the page, read something, looked up. Sustained medical operations under active combat conditions, extended isolation, 0 support personnel. The room was absolutely still. Harrow's face had gone the specific gray of a person realizing that the structure they've been standing on has no foundation. Devereaux put the folder down. She looked at Harrow. "You initiated a qualification review of this personnel. On the basis of that review, you suspended her operational participation. You documented that her qualifications were insufficient for joint exercise participation." Harrow said nothing. "Her qualification record," Devereaux said, "exceeds the operational qualification requirements for this evaluation by a significant margin. In several categories, it exceeds the requirements for the senior combat instructors running the evaluation." The last sentence landed in the room the way certain sentences land, not loudly, but with a weight that doesn't dissipate. Voss, in the corner, made a sound. Very quiet. The sound a person makes when something they knew but hadn't fully accepted becomes undeniable. Devereaux turned to Mara. "I owe you a direct statement." She said it without ceremony, the way honest people make direct statements. "The administrative actions taken against you in the past 48 hours were not supported by the factual record. The qualification basis for your suspension does not exist, and the conduct that preceded and accompanied those actions." She glanced at Harrow, then at the folder, then at the IG representative. "Will require formal review." Harrow said, "Colonel, The file was not available to me. You made the assessment without the file, Devereaux said. That's the problem. I made the assessment based on what she looked like, Devereaux said. The sentence did not have an inflection. It was simply a sentence, but it hung in the conference room with the specific weight of a truth that had been sitting in the room for 2 days and had finally been named. Harrow opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at the folder. He looked at Mara. And something shifted in his face that she had not seen from him before. Not the managed inconvenience, not the institutional authority, not the deliberate small corrections. Something underneath all of that. Something that looked, briefly, like a man seeing himself clearly and not recognizing what he saw. Devereaux looked at Mara. We will need a full account of the administrative irregularities you documented. The scoring anomalies, the routing slip, the directive, all of it. I have it here, Mara said, and laid the folder on the table. Devereaux reached for it, opened it, looked at the first page. Then she looked up at Harrow, and her expression settled into something that was not anger and was not satisfaction. It was the particular expression of a person with authority who has been given exactly the information they needed and is now deciding what to do with it. The IG representative had his pen moving. In the corner, Voss uncrossed his arms. He was looking at the floor. Then, slowly, he looked up at Mara, and the expression on his face was not something she had ever expected to see from him. Not in this room, not in the hangar, not in 4 months at Ironvale. He looked like a man who was trying to figure out how to say something he didn't have the language for yet, something that had been forming in him since the moment she walked out of the first simulation block, and he had stood there with the timer display telling him something about the world that he had been certain, for a long time, could not be true. Before he could find the language, the door to the conference room opened. Braddock stood in the doorway. He had 2 people behind him, in uniform, with the specific, purposeful posture of people who had arrived from somewhere else and were here to do something specific. One of them carried a document case. The other had a tablet and the expression of someone who had been briefed in a vehicle on the way over. Braddock looked at Devereaux. Colonel, the JSOC liaison office completed their transmission. The full operational file is authenticated and cleared. He glanced at Harrow, just briefly. The glance of a person who has been waiting for this room to reach this exact configuration. Then he looked at Mara, and what was in his expression was not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having been right. It was something quieter than all of those things. The look of someone who had seen this kind of moment come for people who deserved it, and had not always been in a position to help, and who had, this time, been in a position to help, and had done it. The document case was placed on the table in front of Colonel Devereaux. She looked at the cover sheet. Read something. Read it again. When she looked up, the room had changed again, and everyone in it felt the change. And whatever came next was not going to be what any of them had expected when they walked in that morning. Whatever came next was not going to be what any of them had expected when they walked in that morning. Devereaux read the cover sheet twice. The second time she read it, she turned to the next page, and then the next. And the room stayed quiet, in the particular way rooms stay quiet when the person with the most authority in them is reading something, and everyone else is waiting to understand what it means. The IG representative had stopped writing. The civilian with the notepad had his pen flat against the table. Even Braddock, who had brought the document case and who presumably knew what was in it, was still. Harrow was looking at the folder with the expression of a man watching water rise. Devereaux closed the document case. She did not open it again. She looked at Mara. Your operational file includes 4 classified deployments, not 3, she said. The 4th is under a compartmentalized designation that required JSOC authentication to release. She paused. It also includes a formal commendation from a Joint Task Force commander for sustained medical operations in an environment without evacuation capability over a period of 11 days. 11 days. The number sat in the room. Voss, still in the corner, made no sound. But something happened to his posture. A slight shift, almost imperceptible. The kind of physical adjustment that happens when a person absorbs information that weighs something. It also includes, Devereaux continued, a Special Operations Combat Medic qualification certified at the advanced level, a Tactical Medicine Instruction certification, and a classified commendation for actions taken during a forward medical operation in which, she glanced at the page, Nurse Calloway was the only qualified medical personnel on site for a 12-person element over a period of 9 days following the loss of the primary medic. Harrow's hands, flat on the table, moved slightly, just slightly. Dr. Harrow? Devereaux's voice had not changed in temperature or pace, and that consistency was, in its own way, more authoritative than any shift would have been. You initiated a formal qualification review of this personnel based on what you characterized as insufficient credentials for joint exercise participation. I was working from the file available to me, Harrow said. He was trying to find the solid ground in the statement, but it kept moving. You were working from a partial file, Devereaux said. Before initiating formal administrative action against any personnel, standing procedure requires a qualification inquiry through the records office. A standard inquiry would have flagged the classification layers and prompted a hold pending full record review. I had no indication there were classification layers. The thin file was the indication. She said it simply, the way a person states arithmetic. A personnel record this short for someone with this many years of service. That's not a gap in documentation, that's a signature of classified service. Standard administrative training covers this. Harrow was quiet. Did you request a records inquiry before initiating the review? A beat. No. Did you consult with the base records officer before signing the routing slip? Another beat, smaller. No. Devereaux looked at the IG representative who had resumed writing, then back at Harrow. We will need a full accounting of the decision process, written, sworn, with timeline documentation. Harrow nodded. The nod had a quality she hadn't seen from him, not the controlled management of inconvenience, something that was past management. He looked, in this moment, like a man who had spent considerable energy constructing a particular version of a situation and had just watched the construction come apart in sequence, piece by piece, and was now sitting in the wreckage of it, trying to understand how it had looked so solid from the inside. She almost felt something about that. Not sympathy exactly. More like the recognition that people like Harrow didn't usually understand what they were doing until the doing was fully done, and the cost of it was sitting in front of them in a manila folder with classification markings. Almost. Devereaux turned to Voss, who was already looking at her, which meant he had been expecting his turn and had been using the time while Harrow was being addressed to prepare himself. Captain Voss, your co-signature on the routing slip. I've addressed that, he said. You said you co-signed in support of the review process, not the outcome. I want to revisit that. He looked at her steadily. To his credit, he didn't reach for an easy exit. I co-signed because Harrow brought me a concern, and I supported the concern without independently verifying the basis. That was an error in judgment on my part. Devereaux looked at him for a moment. It was, she said. We'll document that. She paused. There is also the question of the training block assignment. First entry, day 1. Second block assignment, day 2. In both cases, you assigned Nurse Calloway to the most demanding position in the sequence. The assignments were within the training parameters, Voss said. Were they made in the same spirit as the other assignments? Or were they made to create a failure scenario? He was quiet for a long moment, the longest moment she had seen from him since the inquiry began. He was not a man who admitted things easily. She could see the effort of it in the quality of his stillness. Initially, he said, I intended them to demonstrate that she was out of her depth. The IG representative wrote without pausing. And subsequently? Devereaux asked. Subsequently, I understood that I had misjudged the situation. He looked at the table, then up. Significantly. Devereaux let that sit for a moment. Then she looked at the lieutenant colonel, Merritt, who had been quiet throughout the meeting and who now leaned forward slightly. The scoring anomalies, Merritt said. He had a direct, low voice and the economy of someone who spent most of their day listening. Nurse Calloway flagged 2 instances where evaluation scores were altered between original entry and compiled summary. Both alterations moved personnel from a category requiring supervisory review. He looked at Harrow. Do you know anything about those alterations? No, Harrow said. Do you have access to the evaluation documentation system? Harrow's pause was a fraction of a second too long. As senior medical officer, I have administrative access. That's not what I asked, Merritt said. A longer pause. Yes, I have access. The system access logs have been pulled, Merritt said. We'll have the audit results within the hour. The fraction of a second pause had been all the confirmation the room needed, and everyone in it heard it, and Harrow knew they heard it, and the quality of the air in the conference room changed in the way it changes when something has shifted from probable to certain. Mara watched him. Not with satisfaction. She didn't have access to satisfaction right now. There were too many moving parts, and she'd learned a long time ago that the moment you let yourself feel like something is won is the moment something unexpected arrives. She watched him with the focused attention of someone who is still gathering information because the situation is still in motion. She was right to watch. Because Harrow looked at the table for a long moment, and then he looked at Devereaux, and something moved across his face that she identified, a half-second before it resolved into language, as a decision. I want to consult with legal counsel before continuing this inquiry, he said. The room adjusted around that sentence. Devereaux nodded, once, the nod of someone who had expected this and had the procedure for it already in place. That is your right. We'll recess until your counsel is present. You are not to access any base documentation systems or communicate with personnel involved in this inquiry during recess. Understood? Understood, Harrow said. He stood, straightened his uniform jacket with the automatic gesture of a man who has spent decades using his presentation as armor, and walked to the door. He did not look at Mara. She thought about that afterward, not about what it meant about him, but about what it cost him to maintain that, and how much of his self-concept was wrapped up in the image of a man who was always in control of a room. The door closed. Devereaux looked at Mara. You're released. Return to your duties. We'll contact you when we need the formal account. The full account is in the folder, Mara said. Dates, times, observations. I've kept it factual. Devereaux glanced at the folder Mara had placed on the table, which was still sitting there, which the civilian with the notepad had already tagged with a case identifier. I noticed, she said, and the faintest thing crossed her face. Not a smile exactly, but the suggestion of one, the shape of what a smile would be if a colonel in the middle of a formal inquiry allowed herself one. That's good documentation work. Thank you, Mara said. She walked out. The corridor felt different from the way it had felt when she walked in. Not because anything external had changed. The walls were the same, the lights were the same, the sound of the bass outside was the same. But the weight she had been carrying since the first morning of the evaluation, the specific pressure of a situation that has not yet declared itself, had shifted. Not lifted, shifted. The situation was still in motion, but the motion was in a different direction now. She went back to the medical wing. The afternoon passed in the specific texture of a day that has had its crisis and is now in the aftermath. Still moving fast, still dense with activity, but the frenetic quality replaced by something more purposeful. She handled her patient load, checked in on the 2 trainees from the simulation block, reviewed Duvall's updated cardiac status, which was stable and trending correctly. She ate something at 1500 that she didn't notice eating and drank more coffee than she probably needed. At 1620, the access log audit results reached Merritt's office. She knew this because Finn appeared at the nursing station at 1635, with the expression of someone who had just heard something significant and was trying to contain how significant it was. Harrow, he said quietly. What about him? The audit. Finn glanced left and right, which in the context of the nursing station was a slightly absurd gesture, but she understood the instinct. There are 7 access instances in the documentation system over the past 3 days. 5 of them are routine. 2 of them are, he stopped, chose his word, not routine. They're at times that don't align with any documented administrative task, and they match the timestamps of the anomalies you flagged. She absorbed that. Who told you this? Sandoval. She heard it from the IG rep's assistant when they were in the records hallway. He paused. She shouldn't have been listening. She was listening. Tell Sandoval to keep it to herself. Already did. He hesitated. Mara, he changed those records deliberately. That's what the audit will establish, she said. I know, He pressed his lips together. He's been here 11 years. He trained half the medical staff on this base. I know, she said. It's not... He shook his head. I'm not defending him. I just mean, people are going to have a hard time with this. Yes, she said. They are. She looked at him. That doesn't change what it is. He nodded. He understood that, even if understanding it was uncomfortable. He was 23 years old and he had made a good judgment call when it would have been easier to keep the routing slip in the coordinator's outbox and not get involved. And now he was standing in the medical wing processing the fact that the person whose administrative signature had been on half the authorizations he'd processed in his time at Ironvale had been deliberately corrupting evaluation records. And it was sitting on him with the full weight that it should. She thought he would be all right. People who felt this kind of weight were usually the ones who learned from it correctly. The formal notification reached Harrow at 1800. She wasn't present for it, but the account reached her in pieces throughout the evening through the overlapping channels of information that move through a military base when something significant is happening. The audit had confirmed 2 unauthorized access and modification events in the evaluation documentation system, time-stamped to within 2 hours of the anomalies she had flagged. Harrow's access credentials were the ones on the log. His legal counsel, who had arrived from the JAG office in the early afternoon, had been in conference with him when the notification was delivered. The formal outcome of the notification was a temporary suspension of Harrow's administrative access pending investigation and a required disclosure to the base commander that an investigation was underway. The base commander was a man named General Harlan Prett, who had been at Ironvale for 3 years and who Mara had encountered exactly twice in 4 months. Once at an all-hands medical briefing where he'd been present as an observer, and once in the corridor outside the trauma bay when he'd stopped to ask, without fanfare, whether the overnight admission protocols were being followed correctly. He had the quality, she had noted, of someone who asked questions because he wanted the answers. General Pritt was informed at 1830. By 1900, the base had the specific hum of something that has been set in motion and is not going to stop. Mara was in the break room when Voss found her at 1930. She had a mug of coffee she was not drinking and a printed copy of the next week's staffing schedule she was not reading, and she was sitting with the specific stillness of someone who has been moving at high intensity for 3 days and has found a brief window where nothing is immediately required of her and is not quite sure what to do with it. Voss sat down across from her without being invited and without apologizing for not being invited, which was consistent with who he was. He looked at her for a moment. He looked like someone who had been working on something to say and had gone through several versions of it and was not fully satisfied with any of them but had decided to proceed anyway. "I'm going to make a formal statement to the IG," he said, confirming that the assignment of first entry on day 1 was made with the intent to create a public failure scenario. She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know. It goes on your record." "I know that too." She studied him. In the break room's flat light, without the hangar around him and without the authority of the training floor, he looked like what he actually was. A man in his early 40s who was good at his job and had built certain assumptions into how he operated and was now in the process of excavating those assumptions and finding they didn't hold up the way he thought they did. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because Duval is going to be fine because you were in that hangar. Because you shouldn't have been in a documentation seat when you were the most qualified person on that floor. And because—" he stopped. "Because I was the reason you nearly weren't there at all. And that has a cost. And I should be the one to carry it, not you." She didn't say anything for a moment. "It doesn't fix it," he said. I know that." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." "But it's accurate," he said. "And the record should be accurate." She thought about Harrow's file access logs and what it meant that he had taken the specific action of altering those records while Voss's form of the same basic impulse, the dismissal, the deliberate assignment, the co-signature, had been acted out in the open where everyone could see it. There was something about that difference that was worth understanding. The people who did it in the open were often more correctable than the ones who did it quietly. Not always, but often. "Okay," she said. He looked at her like he expected more than that. "I mean it," she said. "Make the statement. It matters." He nodded. He started to stand, then stopped. "That simulation record. Day 1. What about it?" "When did you last run an entry scenario?" "Before this week." She considered how much to say. "A while ago," she said. "How long is a while?" "Long enough that it surprised me a little too," she said. Something moved across his face. Not a smile, too complicated for a smile, but the beginning of something that might, eventually, become the version of respect that's built on actual knowledge of a person rather than the assumption of it. He stood and left without another word. The next morning, General Pritt addressed the full evaluation assembly in the main briefing room at 0800. Mara had not expected to be there. She had expected to be in the medical wing, or in a conference room with Devereaux's team, or in the corridor outside both of those things, waiting for some administrative process to complete. She had not expected to receive, at 0730, a formal notification directing her to attend the general's briefing as a named individual. She arrived at 0755. The room was full: combat personnel, medical staff, support elements, the full complement of the joint evaluation participants. Braddock was there, near the back wall, with the two people he'd brought to the conference room the previous day. Devereaux was present, to the left of the general's position at the front. Harrow was not in the room. His absence was loud. Voss was in the second row. He did not look at her when she came in. General Pritt walked in at exactly 0800. I was not a large man, but he had the kind of presence that doesn't require size, the still, deliberate quality of someone who has spent enough time in rooms where things matter to have stopped performing anything. He stood at the front without preamble. "I'm going to be direct," he said. "An investigation is underway into administrative conduct relating to the joint evaluation currently running at this base. I am not at liberty to detail the full scope of the investigation at this time. What I am at liberty to tell you is this: the conduct under investigation represents a failure of institutional responsibility that this command will not minimize, delay, or redirect." He looked across the room. "Personnel involved in the investigation have been advised of their status. The evaluation is complete as of this morning. The data stands." He paused. In a room this full, the silence had weight. "There is a second matter," Pritt said. He looked at a point in the room that happened to be near where Mara was standing. "During the course of this evaluation, a member of the medical staff demonstrated operational performance that requires formal acknowledgement." He looked at her directly now. "Nurse Calloway, step forward." She moved to the front of the room. She was aware, peripherally, of the quality of attention in the room. Not the attention of people watching something unexpected, but of people watching something that was confirming what they had already, most of them, understood. "Staff Sergeant Duval is recovering well," Pritt said. "I spoke with his cardiologist this morning. The intervention he received in the hangar on the afternoon of day 2 was the correct intervention, administered correctly, under conditions that would have challenged a fully equipped trauma team." He looked at Mara. "You are not a fully equipped trauma team. You were a nurse who had just been administratively removed from operational duty, standing in a hangar with a first aid kit and the training to use it correctly." A few people in the room shifted. Someone near the back made a sound that wasn't quite anything identifiable but expressed, very efficiently, a range of feelings. "The evaluation record also shows," Pritt continued, "performance across 2 simulation blocks that represents the highest combined score recorded at this facility in the past 14 months. He glanced at the tablet the aide beside him was holding. The first entry block on day 1 set a new simulation record. The close quarters medical tactical block on day 2 scored within the top 3 results this facility has recorded. He put down the tablet. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "This is not a commendation ceremony. That will come later, through the appropriate process. This is a statement of fact made publicly because the events of the past 3 days were public, and the record should be corrected publicly." He looked at the room. Nurse Calloway's qualifications were never in question. The questions raised were the problem. The record now reflects the truth. He looked at her. "Thank you for your service to this unit and to Staff Sergeant Duval." She said, "Thank you, sir." It came out steady, which was what she wanted. What she felt underneath it was something more complicated, and she kept that where it was, for now. She walked back to her position. Finn, 2 rows behind where she'd been standing, had the expression of someone who was maintaining military bearing through considerable personal effort. She didn't look directly at him, but she could see it in her peripheral vision, and it almost undid the steadiness she'd been maintaining, which surprised her. She hadn't expected it to be Finn who almost got through. The room was released at 0830. The investigation moved fast after that, in the way investigations move when the documentation is clean, and the access logs are confirmed, and the personnel involved have made the specific decision to request legal counsel rather than cooperate directly, which is a decision that communicates something about a person's understanding of their own culpability, even when they haven't said anything explicitly. Harrow's administrative access was formally suspended. His patient duties were temporarily reassigned pending the outcome of the investigation. The base legal office communicated to him through his counsel that the evidence assembled, the routing slip, the directive, the access logs, the time-stamped documentation anomalies, the testimony Mara had provided, and that Voss had added to with his formal statement, constituted a case that would be referred to a formal hearing board. He would not resign. She had not expected him to. Men like Harrow rarely resigned voluntarily because resignation required them to write a narrative about themselves in which they were the one who left. And leaving was something they could not frame as their own decision. He would go through the process, and the process would conclude what the evidence required it to conclude, and the outcome would be what the outcome was. Voss's formal statement was filed at 0900. She knew because the IG representative came to the nursing station to confirm receipt and mentioned, as a piece of procedural information rather than commentary, that the statement had been submitted in full and without conditions. She had not asked him to be thorough. He had been thorough anyway. That, she thought, was probably the most accurate data point she had received about who Voss actually was underneath what she'd seen in the hangar. Not a better or worse person than she'd assessed, but a more complex one. Someone capable of the things she'd witnessed, and capable, also, of this. People contained more than their worst moments. She had learned that enough times to have stopped being surprised by it, though it still occasionally arrived with the quality of something new. At 1400, Colonel Devereaux's team delivered the formal case summary to the base commander's office. Mara was not in that meeting, but Braddock was, which she learned from Finn, who had sources she had stopped trying to trace because they appeared to be everywhere. At 1545, she received a notification through the administrative system. Her suspension from operational participation in the joint evaluation was formally rescinded retroactively as of the date of its original issuance. The evaluation record had been corrected. Her scores stood in full. She read the notification on her terminal, sitting at the nursing station. Corpsman Rice was at the adjacent terminal, updating a patient log. She glanced over. Good news? Administrative correction, Mara said. Rice gave her a long look. That's one way to put it, she said, and went back to her log. Mara was reviewing the corrected record and the case summary she'd been copied on when she found the thing she had not expected to find. It was a line item in the administrative record for the investigation, a section she almost scrolled past, formatted in the dry procedural language of a case file, the kind of language that compresses significant things into technical notation. It was in the section that covered the investigation's preliminary findings regarding the routing slip and the suspension directive. The line read, "Secondary review of personnel communications indicates the suspension directive was communicated to external personnel prior to formal issuance." She read it again. The suspension directive had been communicated to external personnel before it was formally issued, which meant someone had been told about it before it was official, which meant someone outside the immediate chain of command between Harrow and the administrative coordinator had known what was coming before it happened. She went back through her mental map of the past 3 days. Who had known? Who had been positioned where? Who had information before they should have had it? She pulled up the administrative notification timestamps on her terminal. The routing slip had been finalized at a specific time. The formal directive had been issued 8 hours later. The external communication had occurred in the window between those two events. Braddock had arrived at the base before the formal directive was issued. She had assumed he'd arrived because someone had tipped him to the pattern of events. The simulation record, the behavior in the hangar, the overall shape of what was happening. That was one explanation, but the more she looked at the timeline, the more she thought there was a second explanation, and the second explanation had a different shape. Braddock had not just observed what was happening at Iron Vale. He had been watching Iron Vale specifically. He had been watching before the evaluation started. She thought about the wording he'd used in the corridor outside the conference room. Not, "I heard what was happening here." He had said, "I want to see how far this story travels." No. She was conflating. He had said, "I've seen this happen to people who came out of there before." Sector 7. He had been watching for it. She sat with that. And then she thought about something else. Braddock had made his phone call while she was treating Duval. Not before. Not when he first arrived. After. What specific thing had triggered that call? She closed the terminal and sat at the nursing station for a long moment, thinking. The investigation was generating outcomes. Hera was in the process of a formal hearing referral. Voss had filed a statement. Her record had been corrected. By every external measure, the situation had moved to resolution. But the line item about external communication sat in the case file like a loose thread, and she had enough experience with loose threads to know that pulling one at the wrong time could either clarify everything or change the shape of the thing entirely. She saved the page, printed it, folded it, and put it in her left pocket with the others. Then she stood up from the nursing station because Duval's afternoon check was in 15 minutes, and she had a patient, and whatever questions she had about Braddock and timelines and who had been watching Iron Veil before this week, and why. Those questions would wait. But when she came back from Duval's room 40 minutes later, there was a message waiting on her terminal, flagged as priority internal, from an address that wasn't in her contact directory and that she did not recognize. The message was 3 sentences. The first sentence said, "There are 7 other nurses from classified units currently serving at non-classified facilities." The second sentence said, "4 of them have active administrative complaints filed against them in the past 18 months." The third sentence said, "We need to talk." There was no name attached. There was no name attached. She read the 3 sentences 4 times. Not because they were difficult to understand, they were clear, and the clarity was exactly the problem. 3 sentences that precise, in that sequence, sent through an internal system to her specific terminal at this specific hour, did not arrive by accident. Someone had written them, knowing what they would mean to her and when she would be ready to receive them. She looked at the sender address. It was formatted like an internal base address, but the prefix was wrong. 2 characters that didn't match the Iron Veil system's standard identifier. External routing through an internal relay. Someone who knew how the base communication system was structured and had access to route through it without appearing external. She printed the message, folded it, left pocket. Then she sat very still for a moment and thought about what it meant that 7 other people were carrying some version of what she had been carrying for 4 months, and that 4 of them had paperwork filed against them, and that whoever had sent this message knew that and had chosen to tell her. She closed the terminal and went to find Braddock. He was not in the hangar, which was empty and in the process of being struck down from evaluation configuration. He was not in the JAG annex. She found him, after 20 minutes of looking, in the small canteen attached to the Special Operations Quarters on the east side of the base, drinking coffee from a paper cup and reading something on a secure tablet that he turned face down when she approached, not quickly enough to be evasive, but quickly enough to indicate it was not for general viewing. She sat down across from him and put the printed message on the table between them. He looked at it, then at her. He did not pretend he didn't know what it was. "You sent it," she said. It wasn't a question. "The content is accurate," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at the message for a moment. "Yes," he said. "How long have you been tracking the administrative complaints?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. 14 months, since the second one was filed." He paused. "The first one, I thought it was isolated. The second one, at a facility in Georgia, against a nurse who came out of a SEAL support element. That was when I started looking. And the others? Washington State, 2 in Texas, 1 in Virginia." He looked at her steadily. "The complaints are varied, different language, different specific accusations. But the pattern is the same. Classified background, posting to non-classified facility, administrative action initiated within the first 6 months, qualification challenged, operational participation restricted." She let that sit. "Someone is running a systematic campaign," she said. "Or," he said carefully, "someone created the conditions for a systematic pattern without coordinating it explicitly. Institutional bias doesn't always need a coordinator. Sometimes it just needs permission, and the permission is cultural. The culture of certain facilities that receive personnel from classified units and don't know what to do with them and default to exclusion." "That's a generous interpretation." "I know." He picked up his coffee. "I'm not sure it's the right one. The Georgia case had documentation anomalies too." That landed. "Same pattern," she said. "Similar enough that when your anomalies came through the investigation summary, I recognized it." He set the cup down. "The Iron Veil case is the 3rd one I've been able to observe directly. It's the first one where the documentation trail is complete enough to build on." She understood what he was saying before he finished saying it. He had been here not just for her. He had been here because her case was the one that could generate a record solid enough to matter. She thought about how to feel about that. She had been carrying 4 months of institutional marginalization and 2 days of deliberate administrative action, and she had documented it with the precision of someone who had learned that documentation was the difference between a thing being real and a thing being acknowledged. And Braddock had needed that documentation for something larger than the resolution of her specific situation. She could have been angry about that. The materials were there. But she thought about the 7 other people. She thought about the nurse in Georgia, the ones in Texas and Virginia and Washington, and she thought about what it meant to come out of a classified environment where you had done things most people would not be able to do, and then be placed in an institution that looked at your thin file and decided the thinness was the measure of you. "What do you need from me?" she said. Something shifted in his face. He had been watching her work through the logic, and whatever he'd seen in the working through had adjusted something in his assessment. A formal statement, specific to the pattern, not just the events at Ironvale, what was done, when, and the documented evidence. He paused. "And your willingness to be named." Named publicly? Named in a formal complaint to the Inspector General at the departmental level, above the base level. It goes to people with the scope to look at all 7 cases simultaneously. She looked at the message on the table between them. 4 of them have active administrative complaints filed against them. Those 4 people were still in their situations. The complaints were still active. Whatever was happening to them was still happening. "Yes," she said. He nodded. Then he said, "It's going to take time. These things move slowly." "I know how these things move," she said. He almost smiled at that. It was the closest she had seen from him. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you do." She picked up the message, folded it, and added it to her left pocket. The pocket was getting full. She went back to the medical wing, and she worked the rest of her shift. The formal hearing board for Marcus Harrow convened 3 weeks later. Mara was not required to be present for all of it. She gave her testimony on the second day. 3 hours in a room with a 5-member board, a JAG representative, and Harrow's counsel, who was competent and professional and working with material that the documentation had largely already decided. She stated facts, she cited dates, she referenced the folder she had built over 3 days and which had been entered into the formal record and which contained, as it turned out, exactly what needed to be contained. Harrow's counsel challenged the chain of custody on the routing slip. The challenge was dismissed. They challenged the interpretation of the access logs. The dismissal was faster on that one. On the 4th day of the hearing, the board received the audit results from the evaluation documentation system, complete and verified, which showed not 2 anomalous access events, but 5, spread over a period of 3 months prior to the evaluation, suggesting a pattern of documentation manipulation that predated Mara's arrival at Ironvale by several weeks and implicated several other personnel evaluations that had been previously closed without review. She heard about the 5th event from Rice, who heard it from the IG representative's assistant, who had apparently given up trying to prevent Sandoval from being in the vicinity of hallways where significant information was being discussed. The board deliberated for 2 days. The outcome was not a surprise. It could not have been a surprise to anyone who had followed the documentation, and by this point the documentation had been followed by enough people that the outcome's shape had been clear for some time. What the board produced was specific and formal and public in the way that military records are public, available to the chain of command, entered into the permanent file, documented with the kind of language that does not leave room for reinterpretation later. Marcus Harrow was found to have violated Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice through willful deception in the conduct of administrative duties. The finding also included a formal determination that his actions constituted abuse of supervisory authority and deliberate falsification of official evaluation records. I was reduced in rank, relieved of clinical privileges, pending civilian medical board review, and transferred from Ironvale with a permanent notation in his service record. He did not look at her when he left the hearing room. She had not expected him to. She had not gone to watch him leave. She had been told the outcome by Devereaux's office through a formal notification, and she had read it, and she had sat with it for a few minutes in the break room with a cup of coffee that went cold while she thought about 11 years and half a base's medical training and what it meant that a person could build something that large on a foundation that eventually required falsified records to maintain. She did not feel triumphant about it. She had not expected to feel triumphant about it. What she felt was something closer to tired, the tired that comes after a sustained effort when the effort is finally done, the kind that is not unpleasant but requires acknowledgement. She drank the cold coffee and went back to her patients. Voss's formal statement had resulted in a letter of reprimand in his service record and a mandatory review of his training assignments for the following evaluation cycle. He had accepted both without appeal. She learned this from the JAG notification summary, not from him, and she respected the choice to handle it that way. He found her in the corridor outside the trauma bay 2 days after the hearing outcome was issued. She was between patients, reviewing a chart, and he walked up and stood there in the way he stood places when he was about to say something he'd decided to say. "I've been assigned to review the joint evaluation training protocols," he said. "The assignment criteria specifically, who gets placed where and on what basis." She had written it over 4 nights, in the break room mostly, when the base was quiet and she had the specific focused attention that comes when you know you are writing something that needs to be precise, because imprecision will cost people something real. She wrote about what had happened at Ironvale, and she wrote about what had happened before Ironvale, carefully, within the limits of what her classification status permitted her to discuss, and she wrote about what it meant to carry a record that institutions couldn't read and be assessed by the silence of it rather than the content. She wrote one paragraph that was not procedural and not evidentiary. It was the last paragraph, and she wrote it because Devereaux had told her she was permitted a personal statement as part of the formal submission, and she had thought about whether to use it, and she had decided yes because 7 other people would read this document, and they deserved to know that someone had been where they were and had written it down accurately. The paragraph said, "The experience of being assessed against a record that cannot be shown is not the experience of being invisible. It is the experience of being required to prove, repeatedly and without institutional support, something that the institution already has the information to know. The problem is not the classification. The problem is the assumption that a thin file means a thin person. That assumption is wrong. The record of this inquiry establishes that it is wrong. I am asking that the record be used as the institution intends records to be used, to prevent the same error from being made again." Devereaux read this paragraph and did not comment on it, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The departmental investigation took 4 months. During those 4 months, Mara ran her shift, trained 2 junior nurses, revised the trauma bay protocols for the new quarter, attended the meetings she was required to attend, and kept showing up in the way that she had always kept showing up. Not because anyone was watching, not to prove something, but because the work was real and the patients were real, and the reason she was here was neither of those other things. Finn rotated out to his next posting in month 2. His last day, he appeared at the nursing station with the awkward formality of someone who does not know how to say goodbye to a person they respect and have chosen as a reference point for something they're still working out. "I'm going to be a better officer because of this," he said, which was a large thing to say, and he seemed to know it was large but said it anyway. "Don't make it about me," she said. "It's not about you," he said. "It's about what I learned watching. That's mine." She gave him that. "Good luck, Finn." He saluted, which was correct and also somewhat formal for the break room, and left. Sandoval stayed. She was good, getting better in the specific way that people get better when they're paying attention to the right things, and have had an early experience that calibrated their sense of what the work actually is. Mara found herself spending more time in the incidental conversations that accumulate around shared shifts, the ones where something is being transmitted without either person formally acknowledging the transmission. How to read a room when you walk into it. How to make a decision when the information is incomplete. How to document things correctly. Not because someone is watching, but because the record is what remains. The departmental investigation concluded in month 4 with a formal finding that a systemic pattern of administrative action against personnel with classified operational backgrounds had been identified across 6 of the 7 cases and warranted remedial policy revision at the joint personnel management level. 2 of the 4 nurses with active complaints had those complaints formally dismissed and removed from their records. A 3rd case was referred for a separate hearing. The 4th, the nurse in Georgia, had resigned before the investigation concluded. Mara read that line in the finding summary and sat with it. Someone had decided the cost was too high before the structure that was pressing down on them had been moved. That happened. It was one of the costs of the pattern persisting as long as it had. She kept the finding summary in the folder that had started with Finn's routing slip. The policy revision was announced on a Tuesday in March, in the dry language of a joint personnel management directive, citing updated procedures for qualification review of personnel transferring from classified assignments. New language required a full classification inquiry before any administrative action. New procedure mandated a 60-day orientation window before qualification assessments could be initiated. New training for receiving facility administrative officers on the signatures of classified service records. She read it on her terminal at the nursing station and thought about the nurse in Georgia. Devereaux sent her a message the week after the finding. 3 sentences again, but different ones. The first said the policy revision had been accepted at the joint level. The second said Mara's anchor documentation had been cited 14 times in the final finding. The third said, "Well done." She printed it. The folder was very full now. 3 months after the policy revision, Ironvale received notification of a new institutional training designation, a designation that formalized what Mara had been doing informally for nearly a year, building a curriculum for medical personnel, transitioning from classified to non-classified environments, addressing the specific gaps that the pattern had exposed. The curriculum needed someone who understood both sides of that transition. The base commander's office asked if she was interested. She thought about it for 2 days, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to think about it correctly rather than reactively, which was a distinction she had learned mattered. On the second day, she went to the Mountain View corridor on the north side of the building, the one that faced west, where on clear days you could see the Front Range with the particular sharpness that comes in late autumn when the air is cold enough to have lost its haze. And she stood there and thought about what she wanted. She wanted the curriculum to be right. She wanted the 7 cases and the 4 dismissed complaints and the nurse in Georgia to have resulted in something real that stayed real after the people involved had moved on. She wanted the younger personnel, Sandoval, people like Sandoval, people like the version of Finn who had stood in a coordinator's hallway and made a judgment call about a routing slip, to have something more to stand on than she had when she arrived here. And she wanted to build it herself because she knew what it needed to contain and why, and because the alternative was having someone build it who hadn't been where she had been and didn't fully understand what was missing. She went back to the nursing station and said yes. The notification of her appointment to the program development role came through the formal system 2 weeks later, with a copy to the base commander's office and a note from Devereaux's office acknowledging the appointment. There was also, attached to the notification as an administrative addendum, a corrected service record, her full record, fully acknowledged at the Ironvale file level, with a formal annotation from the Joint Personnel Management Office confirming the classification layers and documenting their contents. The thin file had been made whole. She read it once, top to bottom. Then she closed the terminal and sat for a moment with the strange, specific feeling of a thing you have carried for a long time being set down. It did not feel the way she had imagined it would feel, in the moments when she had imagined it. It felt quieter than that, less dramatic, more like a door that had been stuck and had simply, one morning, opened. She had not done any of this to be vindicated. She had done it because the work required it, and the record required it, and 7 other people required it. Vindication was what happened when the process completed correctly, and she would take it, but it was not the point. The point was the curriculum she was going to build, and the people who would move through it, and the smaller, quieter versions of the thing that had happened here that might not happen somewhere else, because someone had sat in a break room at 01:30, building a folder and deciding that the record was worth maintaining. She pulled out the folder. It was thick, the routing slip, the directive, the anomaly documentation, Finn's first message, the printed inquiry finding, the departmental complaint, the policy revision summary, Devereaux's note. Everything in order, everything dated, everything factual. She put it in the bottom drawer of the nursing station desk. Not because it was done. The work was not done. The work was beginning. The work would be slow and procedural and would take longer than it should and would be resisted in ways both formal and informal. But because this particular chapter of it had reached its conclusion, and a conclusion deserved to be acknowledged as such. Outside, the Colorado winter had moved toward spring the way it does at altitude, reluctantly, in pieces, with cold mornings that gave way to afternoons that reminded you what warmth was before taking it back. The Front Range was still carrying snow on the upper ridges. In a month, it would begin to recede. She thought about the photograph on her desk. The mountain ridge at dawn, no people in it, just rock and light. She had taken that photograph in Nevada during a training exercise in a year she no longer specified by number, because numbers invited questions she no longer answered in detail. What she remembered about the morning was not the training and not the exercise, but the specific quality of standing on a high place before the day had begun. When the work ahead was large and the outcome uncertain, and the only thing that was certain was that the work needed to be done, and she was the one who was going to do it. That had not changed. The setting had changed. The uniform had changed. The specific texture of the work had changed. But the core of it, showing up, doing the thing that needed to be done, staying until the record was correct, that had always been the same. It would be the same after this. It would be the same in the curriculum she was going to build, and in the personnel she was going to train, and in the rooms she was going to walk into, and the records she was going to insist be read completely. She had been dismissed, and it had cost her something real, and the cost was part of the story now. She was not pretending the cost was not there. She was not going to arrive at a version of this where the 4 months of being called the nurse, like a placeholder, of having her record reduced to its thin, visible surface, of having her presence in the hangar treated as a problem to be managed. She was not going to arrive at a version of this where that had been costless. But she had not broken. She had documented. She had stayed at her station and done the work and let the record accumulate until the record was too complete to ignore, and the record had done what records do when they are complete and accurate. It had told the truth, and the truth had been larger than what the people trying to reduce her had space for. There was something to say about that. Not for herself. She was done performing her own story for any audience. But for the nurse in Georgia who had resigned before the investigation could reach her, and for the ones still in the pattern, and for every person who has ever stood in a room where the assumptions about them are running faster than the evidence for them, and chosen, in the absence of institutional support and in the face of deliberate opposition, to simply keep showing up and doing the work correctly. It is not a small thing to refuse to be made smaller. It costs something to hold your ground in a room that is designed to make you doubt that the ground is yours. But the record is always accumulating. Every correct decision, every documented fact, every moment of choosing precision over reaction and patience over performance, it accumulates. And when someone finally opens the folder and reads it from the beginning, what they find is not the person the institution thought it was dealing with. They find the truth. And the truth, when it is complete and accurate and refused to be set aside, turns out to be the most powerful document in the room. Mara Calloway, 34 years old, scar along the left jaw, photograph of a mountain ridge on her desk, folder in the bottom drawer, curriculum to build, walked to the window of the nursing wing, looked at the front range holding its last snow against the coming spring, and went back to work.